We'll begin to look at the reproductive anatomy. We'll begin with the female reproductive system and then move into the male reproductive system organs as well. So the reproductive system itself, as far as males and females go, we have essentially similar structures that are involved between the two, and we're going to have differences in terms of what they produce and what they make between males and females. But the overall writing process is that both males and female reproductive organs are involved with having a series of organs that are there for the production of gametes, and then a series of organs that are there for the delivery of those gametes to their respective final places, in a sense. And so in the female, there are hormones involved in this process itself, and so we have estrogens, progesterones, that are going to be the primary drivers for the reproductive process itself. The female produces an egg or an oocyte, and this is what's going to eventually become fertilized with the sperm cell itself. And so that actual fertilization occurs when an egg and a sperm are able to fuse to one another. And so during that union, they're then able to create a second cell from the two. So in order for reproduction to occur, we have to take a look at the organs themselves that are involved. And so with that, in the female, we have the primary sex organs themselves are the ovaries. And so resting inside the pelvis, we have the ovaries themselves. And then everything else is basically designed for getting those eggs that are being produced from the ovaries down into the uterus. And so they're going to move along the uterine tubes into the uterus itself. In order to get the sperm cells to the uterus, we need to be able to get them in through the vagina. That then allows for the sperm cells to make their way into the uterus and then eventually up into the uterine or fallopian tubes themselves. Other accessory organs we have things like the glans clitoris and then the mammary glands. Slightly different view of what we just looked at. And so once again, we have the ovaries. So our primary reproductive organ themselves. Those egg cells are going to move once ovulation occurs from the ovary. And so once it has been ovulated from our Graafian follicle, our mature follicle here, and it moves out from the ovary itself, it's going to travel down through the uterine tube and make its way through the uterine tube all the way to the uterus. Somewhere along that uterine tube, generally fertilization is going to occur, and then it's going to come and implant into the uterine wall itself. That's there. We can see other structures here as well. Take a look at the opened up structures. So for the uterine tube itself, we have different regions to it. And so the first kind of funnel-like shaped area is the infundibulum. And attached to it, we then have the fimbria, kind of like little fingers. And those little fingers kind of spread over the ovary itself. There's no direct connection between the ovary and the fimbria or the uterine tube itself. So the uterine tube kind of has to catch the oocyte as it becomes ovulated. So after ovulation occurs, that oocyte is going to be kind of thrust into that uterine tube, and it's going to start to make its journey through the infundibulum, down through the ampulla, in through the isthmus, and then in between the wall, through the wall of the uterus, we then have the interstitial segment, and then again for implantation into the uterine wall at that point. The reproductive organs of the female are kind of held together by assorted ligaments, and so we have different ligaments that are going to help to keep it in place. The largest of which is the broad ligament. So this is going to be this big, almost wing-looking structure that comes out the side, and it's on both sides. We then have the ovarian ligaments, holding the ovaries in their place. Coming anteriorly from the fundus of the uterus, we have the round ligament, and the round ligaments are going to go all the way out to the external part of the body, essentially, and make their way out of the pelvis through the inguinal canal and to the labia majora. And so they're going to embed into the structures that are there as well. The uterus itself has 3 different layers to it. And so what we can see in a sense on the outside, this outer covering, is the perimetrium. We then have the thick layer of wall. We have the myometrium. And then the inner functional layer is the endometrium. The uterus is relatively large in the body, and then the fundus, the dome at the top here. And then it funnels down to the cervix. And so the cervix itself has 2 essential openings. It has the internal os, and then it has the external os. And in between is then the cervical canal. And so this approximately inch-long structure here is what's going to allow for the movement of the birth as the fetus is delivered through the cervix itself. It's going to allow for sperm to make their way in from the vaginal canal into the uterus. And then lastly, if pregnancy does not occur, it's then going to allow for the menstrual flow to move out of the uterus as well. So the ovaries are our place for the production of eggs, or our oocytes. And so there are 2 of them. So there's one on either side of the pelvis itself. Not only are they going to produce the eggs, but they're also going to produce hormones. And so they're going to be the primary place for production of estrogens and progesterones within the body itself for the female that are there. The oocyte production itself occurs out in the outer bands of the ovaries in the cortex, and they form in what are called follicles. And inside those follicles, we have the oocyte. Surrounding the actual follicle itself, we have the follicle cells. And so they're going to surround the actual follicle and maintain its integrity up until the point of ovulation. When we look at any given ovary, we're going to see that it's in different stages of development of follicles themselves. And so we're going to see different stages at any given time, making its way from the most primitive of oocytes. We have our primordial follicles. Those then mature into primary follicles. Those primary follicles into a secondary follicle. And we can see that they're getting larger and larger as they grow. With the secondary follicle, we start to see this empty space inside here, the antrum. So that antrum is going to continue to grow. It's filled with fluid. And once that follicle becomes large enough, we then have a vesicular follicle or a Graafian follicle, a mature follicle. And at ovulation, that follicle is going to rupture. It's going to burst open, and the oocyte, along with a couple of sets of cells surrounding it, are going to make their way out of the ovary. And so surrounding the outside of the oocyte here, we have the corona radiata and the zona pellucida. And so we have 2 different sets of cells that surround the oocyte. And those cells are going to be a barrier essentially for the sperm cells getting into the egg itself. Once that vesicular follicle has ruptured and ovulation has occurred, it's then going to start to develop into a corpus luteum. That corpus luteum is going to produce hormones through the first trimester if pregnancy occurs. If pregnancy does not occur, then that corpus luteum will then degrade into a corpus albicans. And so then it'll become a non-functional structure there and become reabsorbed. So all throughout the ovary itself, we're going to have these different oocytes in different stages of development themselves. And during the process of maturation, typically a single oocyte will then be ovulated as the cycle goes through its ovulation. So oogenesis itself goes through several different phases themselves. And so with females, all of the eggs have been started in their maturation before birth. And so oogenesis begins before birth. During the embryonic and fetal stages, the cells themselves are starting to go through their normal processes. And so in the fetus itself, we're going to see those primordial follicles. And so we're going to see those first cells that are there. One of the factors that we have here is that these cells are diploid. So they are a 2N cell. And so they're going to have both complements of chromosomes within them. And so they're going to have 46 chromosomes at that point. Those cells, the oogonia themselves, start to go through meiosis. And so with this, they're going to go through meiosis twice. And the initial process itself, they're going to get stopped at prophase 1. And so with prophase 1, they're going to be, in a sense, stalled, and those cells are then going to be stuck there as a primary oocyte until puberty. And so at birth, the females themselves have all the eggs that they're ever going to get. They're essentially ready to go, but they're just kind of in suspended animation, so to speak. And so there are several million of these primordial follicles that are inside the ovaries at this point, and they just sit there kind of dormant until puberty. And so they're going to stay there and be stuck at prophase 1 all the way up until puberty itself. At puberty, then that primary oocyte is then going to be, in a sense, tapped to become matured. And so they're going to start the process. During childhood and all the way up until puberty begins, we've gone from 1.5 million to 2 million cells down to some 400,000 or so. And so the numbers have been dramatically reduced in terms of the total numbers of cells that are still there. And so some of the follicles have been broken down, some of them have died, things like that, and they've been lost kind of to attrition, so to speak. From there, those cells are then ovulated once with each cycle. So if a woman has a typical 28-day cycle, every 28 days, there's going to be an ovulation. And so at day 14 of the cycle itself, ovulation occurs, and again and again and again. And so if you kind of do the math with 12 cycles, and then take those 12 cycles and say, just for ease of math, we'll say the woman started her puberty and started to ovulate around the age of 15, and then say she goes all the way up until the age of 50, kind of do an average kind of a period of time there for those. So that means that she's had cycles for some 35 years. So 12 times 35, we're going to then come up with a total number of ovulations of around 420. So of those 400,000 primordial follicles, only about 420 of them have the potential to become ovulated. But then that number is actually going to be reduced if we do things like have pregnancies. And so every pregnancy itself is going to take somewhere in the neighborhood of about, at least for the pregnancy itself, somewhere in the neighborhood of 9 months. So we're going to reduce each pregnancy by 9 months. But in more cases, it's going to be, especially if there's breastfeeding involved, there's going to be a reduction in the months even from there. So the total numbers are going to drop dramatically depending upon pregnancies for the actual numbers of oocytes that get ovulated. Once a woman reaches the age of somewhere between 45 and 55 years of age, they start to become perimenopausal. And so this is where, again, so my kind of big estimate there of 35 years is not necessarily even going to be the case either, because even if they make it all the way to 50 years per se, they can still have their cycles themselves continuing to go. They may ovulate sometimes, they may not ovulate sometimes during those perimenopausal years, and then eventually they get to the point where they've gone a year without a menstrual cycle, and they're then in menopause. So back to puberty, when we start the process of maturing one of those oocytes, this begins with the production of FSH and LH. And so FSH and LH are needed for the processes of the menstrual cycle itself. And so at puberty, up until this point, FSH and LH has not been released because the hypothalamus has not been releasing gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH. And so when that starts to become released, then the anterior pituitary can start to release its FSH and LH. Those FSH and LH levels are going to fluctuate throughout the cycle. And so they're going to have their own kind of levels themselves throughout the cycle. And so they're going to move up and down. And they're important in terms of the different phases of the ovarian cycle itself. And so with that, we have to kind of keep in mind the processes that are going on during each portion. And so when we look at the ovarian cycle, we have the follicular phase where the follicle is essentially making its last changes to get to the point of day 14. And so at day 14, we're going to have ovulation. So the follicular phase begins day 1 with the first day of menstruation. And so on the first day of menstruation, the ovary is going to begin the process of maturing that final follicle for ovulation. So at about day 14, we're going to see ovulation to occur. Usually only one ovary is going to ovulate. Only a single oocyte from that one ovary is going to ovulate as well. If there's the chance for more than one ovulation during that cycle, then there's the potential for fraternal twins. After ovulation, the ovary then goes into the luteal phase, and this is going to go all the way from day 15 all the way till the end of the cycle itself, where day 28 is essentially the last day of the cycle, and the next day would be when menstruation would begin once again. And so days 15 to 28, that follicle that had ovulated, so our vesicular follicle, left behind a large number of cells. Those cells convert into our corpus luteum, and that corpus luteum is then going to secrete progesterone and estrogen throughout the next several days. And so during this, we're going to get to about day 25 or so in terms of the days themselves that are there. And once we get to that point, if fertilization hasn't occurred, then that corpus luteum is going to then start to drop off its levels of progesterone and estrogen, and it's then going to transform from a corpus luteum into a corpus albicans. And then it's going to no longer produce those hormones that are there. If pregnancy does occur, then that corpus luteum is going to stay around typically for the first trimester of pregnancy. So here we have a picture of ovulation itself. We can see that the ovary itself is essentially kind of rupturing, and out with the oocyte we then have the fluid from the follicle as well as the actual oocyte coming out with the zona pellucida and the corona radiata along with it. The process of ovulation, since it does kind of rupture through the ovary, this can sometimes be felt by females. And so when they get this twinge of pain on ovulation, this is what's called Mittelschmerz. So as we look at the oocytes themselves, we can kind of see what's going on within the cells themselves. We said that up until birth and at birth, the cells themselves get stuck in the primordial follicle stage, and they're going to be in prophase 1. So then once puberty occurs, we're going to take one single oocyte, and that one single oocyte is going to continue on from prophase 1. It's going to continue through the first set of divisions, and it's then going to be stuck again at metaphase 2. And when that occurs, we create two cells. So we now have a 1N cell. So we've gone from a 2N cell up here to a 1N cell down here. And we now have two cells. So we have our first polar body, and then we have the actual secondary oocyte over here. Both of them have reduced the number of chromosomes that they have from 46 down to 23. So each one of these cells only has 23 chromosomes. The first polar body is going to be basically a non-functional cell. And so it's not going to be able to be fertilized. It's not going to be able to divide. It's not going to be able to do anything at that point. From there, though, if our secondary oocyte goes on to become fertilized, then the cell is going to continue on through meiosis, and the chromosomes from the sperm cell are going to line up with the chromosomes from the oocyte, and it's going to complete meiosis 2, and we now have a fertilized cell at that point from there. If fertilization doesn't occur, then essentially the cell becomes stopped at this point here, and nothing happens to it further. But if it did become fertilized, when it completes that meiosis 2, we're going to create another cell. So we're going to create a second polar body, and then we're going to have the actual fertilized cell. We now have our ovum. And so this is now a completed cell, and that then continue on to divide from there. Once again, that second polar body is not going to be a functional cell. It's just going to die off, and we don't have it. But the key here is that we started out with one cell. That one cell divided, and we had our secondary oocyte and our first polar body. That second cell, then if it became fertilized, became our ovum and our second polar body. So we now have two cells there. That first polar body is going to divide again, and we end up with 4 total cells. But 3 of those cells are non-functional. We'll see that when we talk about the male reproductive cycle that we're going to go from a single cell into 4 functional cells. So after ovulation, the oocyte is going to be caught up into the fallopian tubes. And so the fallopian tubes or the uterine tubes are going to make their way down towards the uterus. The first portion are the fimbria. And so these are like finger-like little projections that kind of almost think of like putting your fist inside your other hand. Your fingers as they surround your fist are kind of like the fimbria themselves. They have ciliated cells inside of them. So ciliated simple columnar epithelium lines the inside there. And that's going to help to push that oocyte towards the uterus, as well as through smooth muscle contractions, giving peristaltic waves, moving that oocyte towards the uterus. The entire journey itself, to go from the ovary all the way down to the uterus, is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 6 days, usually on the 6-day side there. If, as it makes its way down towards the uterus, that 5 to 6 days, it must have been fertilized for that cell to remain viable. And so the oocytes themselves are only viable for about 12 to 24 hours. So you've got about a 1-day window where that cell must be fertilized in order for it to continue on in terms of living. If it's not fertilized, the cell's going to die, and it will still get kind of swept down to the uterus, but it's not going to be able to be functional from that point on. And so here we have the ovulation occurring and then sperm cell coming into it. Fertilization occurs somewhere along the uterine tubes themselves, and then implantation into the uterus there. And so by about 6 days, it's now implanted into the uterus. So we're now up to day 20, and implantation has occurred. Inside the uterus's job is basically make everything ready for implantation. And so as the ovum starts to come down through the uterine tubes and make their way to the uterus itself, the uterine wall is going to become more and more developed for the process of implantation itself, so that eventually the placenta can be able to integrate itself into the wall of the uterus. If no fertilization occurs, then the functional layer of the uterine wall is going to then be sloughed off. It's going to be shed during menstruation itself. When we look at uterus, we can see that we have a fundus, we have a body, we have a cervix. And so we have something that kind of looks like this in a sense. And so the fundus, the dome at the top, we then have the body, and then we have the cervix down at the bottom there. 3 separate layers to it, as we talked about before. And so we have the parametrium on the outside. We have a set of smooth muscle in the middle, the myometrium, so red for muscle there. And then the functional layer, we then have the endometrium on the inside. So parametrium on the outside, myometrium in the middle, and then the endometrium on the inside of the uterus. And that's going to provide for a place for developing the embryo and then eventually the fetus as well. All of that smooth muscle that's inside there is going to contract strongly, remember, when we have oxytocin being released during labor. And so the posterior pituitary is going to release all of that oxytocin. That oxytocin is going to go down and cause massive uterine contractions. Just as the ovaries have a cycle, the uterus has a cycle as well, and so we have the uterine cycle also. Again, this begins on day 1. And so at day 1, we're going to have the beginning of the menstrual phase. That's going to last as long as the menstrual period continues on. So typically anywhere between 1 and 5 days, sometimes even a little bit longer. And then after that point, that functional layer of the endometrium has been sloughed off. Now it's time to regrow it. And so the proliferative phase is going to continue up till day 14. And so this is going to be the initial kind of growth of the endometrium itself. It still, in a sense, has all the way up until somewhere around day 20 or so to continue to grow and get ready for implantation to occur during that period of time as well. These first 2 portions here in terms of the menstrual phase and the proliferative phase, this is where we can have kind of changes in time a little bit. And so things can kind of alter. So if a woman's cycle is shorter or longer than 28 days, it's this half of the cycle that it's going to be altered on. Because we have a finite time after ovulation occurs, and so day 14 ovulation occurs, we end up going into the secretory phase for the uterus, and we have just a finite time for that oocyte to remain viable and implantation to occur. So the last half of the cycle here is kind of fixed in terms of its timeline that is there. So the corpus luteum is producing progesterone, and as it produces progesterone from the corpus luteum, that's going to make the uterine lining continue to grow and grow and grow. It's increasing in all of the blood vessels that are there, and it's basically ready for implantation. It's ready for that ovum to start to come down and become implanted into the uterine lining itself. If it's not fertilized, then the corpus luteum starts to stop producing progesterone, and that functional layer is then going to start to die off. And so that's where we're then going to begin the next phase once again, and we move into then the menstrual phase from there. In order to do essentially just about everything for reproduction for the female, the vagina is needed. And so the vagina is there as the birth canal, it's there as the area for menstrual flow to go through, as well as the copulatory organ for reproduction itself for females. Has a large amount of muscle surrounding the vaginal canal itself. It connects directly up to the uterus, and so it makes its way up to the uterus and then extends to essentially the outside world, making its way out to the anterior side of the body that's there. Lots of blood vessels coming into it, lots of lymphatics. So since it is exposed to the outside world, we need to be able to maintain a safe environment, in a sense, for the reproductive organs themselves. And so not only does it have a good lymphatic supply, it also has numbers of glands that are producing secretions that are going to reduce the amount of bacteria that are there. And so they're going to be restricted in terms of their growth by having all of those secretions there and keeping the pH relatively low and acidic so that they cannot grow in the environment that is there. The external genitalia for the female involves the structures that are in and around the vaginal canal itself. And so just superior to the vaginal canal, we have the mons pubis. And so this is skin and adipose that covers over the pubic symphysis. It's then at puberty. This is the region that is going to be covered over by pubic hair. Covering over the actual entrance to the vaginal canal, you have the labia majora and then the labia minora that are there. The labia majora has a homologue to that of the male, meaning that it has a similar structure that is there. So the labia majora is homologous to that of the scrotum in the male. And then the labia majora has a male homologue as well. And this is the dorsal side of the penis. The skin that is there is the same as that of the labia minora. Beyond the labia minora, we then go into the vestibule. And so this is the opening for the vaginal canal itself. And then we have kind of lining the sides there, a series of vestibular glands. And once again, those vestibular glands are going to have a male homologue, and those are going to be the bulbourethral glands in the male, kind of doing the same thing between that of the male and female. It's there for lubrication during copulation. For the mammary glands, we have the structures themselves generated by the actual glandular tissue themselves, and that feeds up to the nipple. And so the nipple itself is going to have the openings for all of the ducts for each of the actual glands themselves. So multiple small little openings that are there that feed back into each of the ducts of each of the mammary glands. They feed up on their own. Surrounding the nipple, you then have the areola. And so this is a pigmented, kind of a roughened type of a skin surface that is there. Allows for better letting on during the suckling phase. And so here we can see each individual gland in itself. So we have a lobe. That lobe then feeds up into a lactiferous duct and a lactiferous sinus. And then each one of those glands has its own duct that feeds up to the nipple itself down there. And so each one of those glands, in a sense, is kind of independent, and they produce their own milk, not kind of like a big collective process itself that's there. So comparing the males and the females in terms of reproduction, they are both basically dormant until puberty. And so although females do have their oocytes already produced before puberty, they're still not functional at that point. Both are going to go through a process in terms of maturation of secondary sexual characteristics as well as the primary sexual characteristics themselves. When it comes to females, you're going to see the development of the mammary glands themselves. You're going to see in males the development of coarse terminal hair on the face, the arms, the legs turning into a terminal hair. In both sexes, you're going to see the presence of axillary hair and pubic hair as maturity starts to occur as well. The difference then comes into production. As we've seen, the female only produces a single oocyte monthly that is ovulated, versus males have the potential capability of producing just a vast quantity of sperm in a single day. And so as many as 100 million or so sperm on a daily basis, and this all depends upon when and how often ejaculation has occurred as well. So some of the structures that I just mentioned that were homologous between males and females. So between males and females, they both have a gonad, and so they have the ovaries versus the testes. Both have a glans. So you have a glans penis and you have a glans clitoris for the male and the female. The labia majora, its homologous structure is the scrotum, and then the vestibular glands in the female are homologous to the bulbourethral glands in the male. Moving on to male reproductive system. So essentially the structures themselves are effectively the same in the sense that we have a gonad, and so you have the testes here in the male, and then a series of ducts that are going to deliver those sperm cells to the female. And so essentially the same process for the female itself in terms of the ducts that are there. And then in addition to that, the male is then going to produce a fair amount of secretions in the form of glands that are going to help with the process of ejaculation itself. And so the seminal vesicles, the prostate gland, and the bulbourethral gland, all adding to the seminal fluid that is there. For the male, you then have the copulatory organ, that of the penis, there for copulation. Beginning with the testes themselves, we have protection for the testes via the scrotum. And so once again, this is the equivalent of the labia majora in the female that is there. They're going to cover over the testes, and the testes then have several layers to them that are kind of surrounding them as well. And so a couple of which are muscles. And so we have muscle here and muscle here. And so we have the cremaster muscle that runs kind of longitudinally along the spermatic cord. And then we have the dartos muscle that runs just deep to the skin of the scrotum. And so the two structures that are there, these are going to allow for changes in position of the testes. And so during production of sperm, the sperm require a slightly lower temperature than that of body temperature. And so they need to be allowed to kind of alter their temperature in a sense by either, if the outside temperature is cool, the cremaster and the dartos muscle are going to pull the testes closer towards the body. If the body temperature and outside temperature is more warm, then the muscles are going to relax, and that's going to allow for the testes to essentially move away from the core of the body to keep that temperature roughly 1 degree centigrade lower than that of the total body temperature itself. That's there. We can see that the spermatic cord here is coming down through the inguinal canal. And so it comes down through the inguinal ligament there. As it does so, it's going to drag with it parts of the abdominal wall. And so part of the covering over the testes, we can't really see it on this picture here, but part of the covering, the tunica vaginalis that surrounds the testes themselves, is actually part of the abdominal wall. That's there. The testes themselves on the inside have several different structures with them. Where the actual sperm production is occurring is within the seminiferous tubules. And inside those seminiferous tubules, we have some different cells. And so we have sustentacular cells, and then we have interstitial cells, or that are around and surrounded by the interstitial spaces that are there. The sustentacular cells, these are the cells that are going to essentially help with keeping the sperm cells alive. And so this is going to be the actual nursing of the cells that are there. to allow for sperm production to occur. The interstitial cells are the ones that are going to produce hormones. And so these are going to be producing the testosterones that are needed in order for spermatogenesis, for the production of all of the secondary sexual characteristics themselves. Once the sperm is produced inside of those seminiferous tubules, they then move over to the epididymis, and the epididymis is going to essentially be posterior along the testes themselves. And so it's kind of along the posterior and superior side of the testes. It has a head and a tail as it kind of comes down to a finer point in a sense. And that then continues on as the vas or ductus deferens from there. That's inside. The epididymis's job is to initially help to kind of mature the sperm cells. And so as they come from the testes themselves, so the testes would be in here in the middle there, as they come from the testes and they then sit inside the epididymis, they're going to be there to mature them. And so they're going to be there to kind of keep them alive, reduce some of the extra fluid that was released with them from the seminiferous tubules as they came down. The cells themselves then become ejected during ejaculation, and the cells themselves are then hopefully at that point ready for prime time. They're ready to go. They've been matured well enough, and so they're not going to be able to function in any kind of abnormal process. They need time. As they sit inside the epididymis, they're not moving, they're immobile. Any cells that may die or become there too long are going to be degenerated, they're going to be broken down, and their substance essentially recycled. So here we have, once again, the epididymis. So you have the head, comes down to a skinnier tail. And then from the tail, moving into the ductus or vas deferens. And that's then going to head up the spermatic cord itself. So the vas deferens, the sperm cells are going to enter into it during ejaculation itself. It has smooth muscle running along it. Those smooth muscles are going to squeeze inward peristaltically to allow for the sperm cells to become ejected. And that's then going to send them out during ejaculation itself that are there. The vas deferens is then going to move all the way back into the pelvis. So go through the inguinal ligament, come back into the pelvis, essentially go around the bladder, and meet up with the seminal vesicles. And so they're going to come back down around, meet up with the seminal vesicles at the prostate. There, they're going to essentially combine all of their contents to allow for the production of the seminal fluid itself. The urethra, we talked a little bit during the urinary system, and the urethra is going to allow for, in males, both urine and the transport of sperm. That's there. So it's kind of a double process there. It has three different sides to the urethra itself. And so the urethra has the prostatic portion, the membranous portion, and then the spongy portion running through the corpus spongiosum of the penis itself. And so the penis can be divided up into basically three chambers. And so there are the corpus spongiosum and then the corpus cavernosum. There are two cavernosum and one spongiosum. The cavernosum are the erectile tissue, and so this is what is going to be infiltrated by blood during erection. The corpus spongiosum is going to stay relatively unerect to allow for the sperm to eventually come through the urethra itself that's there on that. The penis then can be divided up in terms of itself, can be divided up into the root And so we have the root then to the body of the penis. The root, and then the glands that is there. The glands itself is covered over typically by the prepuce or the foreskin, and so that's going to provide protection to the glands itself. And the glands that are in between the prepuce and the glands are going to produce a secretion called smegma that's going to develop in between and help with protection of, once again, the glands itself that's there. So for the production of seminal fluid, we have obviously the sperm, but then we also have to add in their secretions coming from the seminal vesicles, from the prostate gland, and from the bulbourethral gland. And so each one of those combines together to allow for the production of the seminal fluid that is there. Upon ejaculation, anywhere between 2 and 5 milliliters is a normal production. And within that, in a typical sample, there's going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 500 million sperm cells that are there. And so with that, the sperm cells then are going to be released, and they're going to make their way down towards the female at that point. Those seminal fluids that are there do a couple different things. One of the things is, remember that in the epididymis, the sperm cells are non-motile, so they have to become activated. So they have to be, in a sense, kind of turned on. And in that process, they then can start to move around. In addition to that, they're going to provide them with some things that they're going to need along the way. Things like nutrients, some enzymes. They need to protect them from the vaginal canal, so we need some buffers for the acidity that's there. And then lubrication and giving them something to swim in as they're delivered to the female themselves, with the potential that they make it all the way to the egg themselves. So of those millions of cells that are released with the ejaculation, some 1 million or so only actually get to the oocyte, or potentially get to the oocyte. And what we have to remember is that for the female, if we kind of draw out the structures that are there, kind of crudely, you have 2 ovaries, which means that as a sperm cell enters into the uterus, it's got to make a choice. Does it go towards the left uterus, or does it go towards the right uterus? And as that process occurs, depending upon which side the oocyte had been released from, that then determines whether it's going to be able to go and find the egg and the sperm together that's there for those. So those accessory glands themselves that are going to make up the seminal fluids themselves, we have the seminal vesicles. They are paired on the posterior aspect of the urinary bladder. We can see the vas deferens coming back into the pelvis. They're going to come by the seminal vesicles. The seminal vesicle and the vas deferens are going to essentially kind of join together and become the ejaculatory duct. And so they come between the two there and become the ejaculatory duct. The ejaculatory duct gets us to the prostate, and that then enters into the prostatic urethra. So the prostate is then going to release its secretions. The seminal vesicle has released it. Between the seminal vesicles and the prostate gland, we get some 90% of the total of the fluid itself, with the seminal vesicles producing the majority of it. Bulbourethral glands at a small amount, but those bulbourethral glands have been working essentially to cleanse the urethra before ejaculation has occurred, to get it going out of the spongy urethra from the beginning, and that allows to kind of cleanse things out beforehand. And then the remainder is the actual sperm cells themselves. So the seminal vesicles themselves produce the largest amount of fluid for the seminal fluid itself. This produces kind of a whitish, yellowish, rather alkaline type of fluid. This is again going to regulate the pH, and so both in the potentially in the urethra and then in the female as well, in through the vaginal canal and then into the uterus for both of them. Provides them with some monosaccharides or sugars for nourishment along their travels that are there, and then some prostaglandins. Those prostaglandins are going to essentially work on the female, so to speak, to do things like slightly dilate the cervix, cause smooth muscle contractions in the vaginal wall as well, to allow for essentially getting the seminal fluid further into the female themselves. The prostate gland's secretions are the prostate is just at the opening of the bladder and then continues down to the spongy urethra that is there. It produces a secretion, and one of the more important aspects of what's there is prostate-specific antigen, and that prostate-specific antigen is going to be found both in the seminal fluid as well as in a male's blood as well. So the PSA can be done as a test to determine how much is there in the male, whether they potentially have prostate problems. In addition, seminal plasmin is going to be released as well. This is going to potentially work against any kind of bacterial infection that may be going on in the female that is there as well. So here we can see the prostate gland and the seminal vesicles. Seminal vesicles, here comes the vas deferens. There we have the ejaculatory duct, and then into the prostate. The bulbourethral glands, sometimes called the Cowper's glands. These are relatively small. They're inside the urogenital diaphragm. These ones are going to secrete a clear alkaline, kind of slippery type of a secretion. This is going to be released all throughout intercourse itself, and so it's going to be released before actual ejaculation occurs, and that's going to allow for essentially the cleansing of the urethra before the sperm are going to enter into it. The hormones that are produced for the male, some of them are familiar to that of the females, and so we have the GnRH, once again, our gonadotropin releasing hormone. At puberty, this becomes activated as well, and that's going to cause the release, once again, of LH and FSH, and so luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. The follicle stimulating hormone is going to do basically the same thing as it does in the female, in that here it's going to begin spermatogenesis, and so it's going to begin the production of sperm cells, as well as luteinizing hormone is going to control the production of testosterone. So similar to that in the female as well. And testosterone being the main male hormone for reproduction itself. That's there. Responsible for the control of production of gametes, and so the sperm cells, as well as providing for sexual reproduction of and maturation of the secondary sexual characteristics and maturation of the sexual organs themselves. Unlike females, males don't really have any kind of a pause in their reproductive processes. With age, sperm production typically does go down, but there is no cessation really of sperm production until very late in male life.